The station hung in space like a silver ring around the massive orange gas giant called Vareth 9. Its name was Conquered Ring, and it was the most important meeting place in the known galaxy. Every major species sent their best diplomats here when something needed to be decided. Today was one of those days. The great hall inside the station was enormous, big enough to hold thousands of alien delegates from dozens of worlds. The ceiling was made of clear material that let in the glow of Vareth 9 outside. It made everything inside look warm and orange, like a slow fire burning in the distance. But the mood inside was not warm at all. Ambassador Ilara Voss stood at the human podium in the center of the hall. She was a tall woman with short dark hair and calm brown eyes. She wore the standard blue uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps with a small silver pin on her chest that carried the image of Earth, a blue marble floating in black. She had been speaking for nearly an hour, presenting humanity's case for access to the trade lanes that ran through Creon space. The Creon Dominion was a massive empire, old and powerful, built over thousands of years by a species that looked like enormous insects, tall, hard-shelled, with 4 arms and eyes like black glass. They had ruled large sections of the galaxy, long before humans had even invented the wheel. And they knew it. Lord HFY, the Creon High Consul, sat on the elevated platform reserved for dominant species. He was the largest Creon in the room. His shell was dark red, almost black at the edges, and the markings on his chest showed a rank so high that most aliens in the room would not even look directly at him. He had not looked at Ambassador Voss once during her entire presentation. He was talking quietly to one of his advisors, occasionally clicking his mandibles in what the translation devices identified as mild amusement. The other delegates watched. There were Valorians, tall, thin, pale beings with silver eyes who were known as the oldest living species in the galaxy. There were the Doraki, a short and wide species covered in dark fur who ran most of the galaxy's banking systems. There were dozens of others, each one watching the human woman speak, each one quietly curious about how this would end. Near the side wall, on a small chair that had been brought in specially, sat a child. She was 7 years old. Her name was Maya Voss. She had her mother's dark hair, cut short and a little uneven because she had tried to cut it herself 3 weeks ago. She wore a yellow dress and had a small stuffed animal tucked under one arm, a bear, brown and old and missing one button eye. She was drawing in a notebook, completely focused, her small tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth the way it always did when she was concentrating. She had come with her mother because Ambassador Voss believed in something that most professional diplomats thought was naive. She believed that showing the galaxy a human child was the most powerful statement humanity could make. A child was not a weapon or a fleet or a threat. A child was proof of hope. It said, "We are not here to conquer you. We are here because we want our children to live in peace with yours." Most of the alien delegates understood this message and respected it, even if they did not fully share the feeling. Lord HFY understood it too. He simply did not care. Ambassador Voss reached the final section of her presentation. She spoke clearly and without rushing, her voice steady and professional, her hands resting flat on the podium as she outlined the final terms of humanity's trade proposal. It was a fair offer, genuinely fair, and several delegates were already nodding. The Valorian elder in the front row had made a small note on his data pad that his assistant later described as favorable. Lord HFY stood up. The room went quiet immediately. When a Creon High Consul stood during a session, it meant he was about to speak. And when Lord HFY spoke, the galaxy listened. He did not address Ambassador Voss. He did not address the assembly. He turned and looked directly at Maya. Then he spoke one sentence to the 2 Creon guards standing near the wall. The translation devices in the room processed his words in under a second. Every delegate heard the translation in their own language at exactly the same moment. He said, "Bring the small human here." The guards moved before anyone had time to react. They crossed the floor in long, fast strides and reached Maya's chair before she even looked up from her drawing. She looked up just as one of them grabbed her arm. She did not scream right away. She just looked confused, the way children do when something happens that makes no sense to them at all. Ambassador Voss took one step forward from the podium. One of the Creon diplomatic aides raised a hand and spoke quickly, a technical phrase that invoked a procedural freeze on physical intervention by any delegate during an active High Consul address. It was an old rule designed for debates. It had never been used like this before. The aide knew that. Everyone in the room knew that. But the rule existed, and no one moved. Lord Shethvar walked slowly down from his elevated platform and stopped in front of Maya. He looked down at her the way someone might look at an insect they had just found in their food, not angry, not passionate, just faintly disgusted. He reached out with one of his lower arms, slowly and deliberately, and he hurt her. It was not an accident. It was not a warning. It was a statement. He looked at the assembly as he did it and said, in a clear, loud voice, "This is what the Creon Dominion thinks of human claims in our space." Maya cried out. It was a sharp, high sound, the sound a child makes when real pain arrives suddenly and without warning. It lasted only a moment before she pressed her face against the stuffed bear and went quiet, shaking. The hall was absolutely silent. Not the silence of people who had not heard. The silence of people who had heard everything and did not know what to do with what they were feeling. Several delegates looked away. A Doraki banker near the back stood up and then sat back down and then stood up again and did nothing. The Valorian elder stared at Lord Shethvar with an expression that was very hard to read. Lord Shethvar turned back toward his platform, satisfied. He believed he had made his point. He believed that what came next would be what always came next: protests, formal complaints, weeks of negotiations in which the weaker party slowly accepted what the stronger party had already decided. He believed this because it was always how things worked. He was wrong. Ambassador Alara Voss had not moved during any of this. She stood exactly where she had been standing when the guards first crossed the room. Her face had not changed. She did not look angry. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had already made a decision before the situation even started, like someone who had been carrying a particular answer in her pocket for a long time and had just been given the question. She picked up the small comm link on the podium. She pressed the direct channel to Earth Command. She waited exactly 1 second for the connection to confirm. Then she spoke 4 words. Her voice was completely calm, completely flat, like someone reading a number off a page. She said, "Invoke the Pale Doctrine." Then she set the comlink down, walked past the podium and went to her daughter. She picked Maya up and held her close. Maya buried her face in her mother's neck. Ambassador Voss looked at Lord Shethvar over her daughter's shoulder. He was already looking back at her. For the first time since the session began, he was paying attention to a human. He opened his mandibles to speak. But across the galaxy, on a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star, every screen went dark for exactly 3 seconds. Then a single tone played on every channel simultaneously. It was low and clear, and it rang out across Earth like a bell. No one alive had ever heard it outside of history lessons. But every human knew exactly what it meant. In the hall on Conquered Ring, a Valorian aide leaned toward his elder and whispered a question. The elder did not answer right away. He looked at Ambassador Voss, still holding her child, still looking at Lord Shethvar with those quiet, flat, dead star eyes. Then the elder said quietly, "Start searching the restricted archives." "What are we looking for?" the aide asked. The elder was already standing up. "Something humans buried 200 years ago," he said, "something we should have read more carefully." The Valorian archive room was deep inside the lower levels of Conquered Ring. It was a small room, mostly ignored, used mainly by historians and bored academic delegates who had nothing better to do between sessions. The elder Valorian who walked into it now was named Salvor. He was 412 years old, which made him one of the oldest living beings in the known galaxy. He had seen wars. He had watched empires rise and collapse. He had sat in the assembly hall when 3 different species had been formally recognized as extinct. He had never once in 412 years felt what he was feeling right now. It was not fear exactly. It was something older than fear. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something enormous and dark, and realizing that the edge had been there the whole time, and you had simply never looked down. He sat at the archive terminal and began searching. His aide stood behind him, quiet and smart enough not to ask questions. The first few searches came back with standard results: diplomatic records, trade histories, population data. Then Salvor typed 2 words: "Pale Doctrine." The terminal returned a result with a small red marking in the corner, a classification symbol that had not been used in over a century. He opened the file. The first layer was standard, a brief summary describing the Pale Doctrine as a historical military contingency plan, developed by Earth's unified command approximately 200 years ago, formally sealed and removed from active status following the long peace agreements. He kept reading. The second layer required a secondary access code. Salvor had one of the highest archive clearances in the assembly, one of the few benefits of being 400 years old and having sat on 7 different oversight committees. He entered the code. The file opened. He read in silence for a long time. His aide watched the old Valorian's silver eyes move across the screen and noticed, for the first time in years of service, that his elder's hands were not steady. Back on Earth, no one was panicking. That was the thing that would later confuse and disturb alien observers more than anything else. There were no speeches. There was no declaration of war broadcast on public channels. There was no footage of angry crowds or grieving families or politicians standing at podiums with fire in their eyes. There was just work. Earth's unified command had activated within 40 seconds of Ambassador Voss's transmission. Senior Admiral Yara Chen sat at the head of the command table in the deep underground facility beneath the Pacific Ocean that served as Earth's primary military nerve center. She was 61 years old, compact and quiet, with gray hair pulled back tight and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she never actually used for reading. She had served in Earth's military for 38 years. She had never once fired a weapon at a living target. She had spent 38 years hopping. She would never need to. She looked at the Pale Doctrine activation notice on her screen for exactly 4 seconds. Then she started working. Around her, the room filled with the sound of calm voices, keyboard inputs, and the soft hum of systems coming online that had been sleeping for 200 years. No one cried. No one raged. A young lieutenant near the back of the room had to press his lips together hard for a moment when he thought about why the activation had been triggered. One child, one small voice, one high sharp cry across a comlink that had been accidentally left open for 3 seconds before Ambassador Voss muted the local feed. He pressed his lips together, breathed once, and went back to his work. That was all. Across the galaxy, alien governments were not as calm. In the Doraki banking capital, the senior council chair received the report of the Pale Doctrine activation mid-meal, and knocked his entire food tray onto the floor. He did not stop to clean it up. He was already calling his military advisor before the tray finished clattering. The Doraki had always prided themselves on being practical people. They valued information above emotion. So the first thing the senior council chair did was order his research team to find out exactly what the Pale Doctrine was. His research team came back to him in 40 minutes. They looked frightened. "Well," he said. The lead researcher set a data pad on the table. "We found fragments," she said, "incomplete records mostly, because humans sealed the full documentation." "What do the fragments say?" She was quiet for a moment. "They say that humanity spent the first 2 centuries of their interstellar expansion doing 2 things simultaneously," she said. "The first thing was building diplomatic relationships and presenting themselves as a peaceful trading species. And the second thing, quietly prepositioning autonomous military infrastructure at strategic locations throughout the known galaxy," she said. "Survey satellites. They called them. The records show over 40,000 registered survey satellite deployments in the past 200 years. The council chair stared at her. 40,000, he said. "Yes. And they were not survey satellites." "No," she said, "they were not." In Crethon space, Lord Shethvar had returned to his personal ship after the assembly session. He was not concerned. He had made his statement. He expected protests. He expected a formal diplomatic complaint filed through the standard assembly process, a process that could take between 6 and 18 months to produce any result, during which time his dominion would continue operating exactly as it always had. One of his senior military commanders, a veteran named Vethar, requested an urgent meeting the moment Shethvar boarded. Shethvar agreed to see him, mostly out of routine. Vethar entered the room, and Shethvar immediately noticed something unusual. The old commander was scared. Not professionally worried, the way military officers got worried about logistics and resource allocation. Actually scared the way Prey got scared. "What is it?" Shethvar asked. "The humans have invoked something called the Pale Doctrine," Vethar said. "I know," Shethvar said. "It is probably a formal military escalation protocol, a way to put political pressure on us through their allied species." "I do not think that is what it is," Vethar said. He set a data pad on the table. Shethvar looked at it. It showed a map of Crethon space. Across the map were small blue dots, hundreds of them, spread throughout their border systems, their colony worlds, their deep space lanes, their fleet positions. "What are those?" Shethvar asked. "Those are the registered positions of human survey satellites," Vethar said. "I pulled the public registry records." Shethvar looked at the map for a moment. Then he looked up at Vethar. "They are everywhere," he said. "Yes," Vethar said. "They have been sitting inside our space for 200 years. "Yes." Shethvar was quiet. Something was moving in the back of his mind, something that felt like understanding arriving too late, like recognizing a trap only after you had already stepped into it. "Begin evacuation protocols," he said, and his voice was different now. "Of which systems?" Vethar asked. Shethvar looked at the map again. The blue dots covered everything. "All of them," he said. Back on Conquered Ring, Ambassador Voss sat in the station's medical bay with Maya on her lap. A human medic was cleaning and bandaging Maya's arm. Maya had stopped crying a while ago and was now leaning against her mother, heavy with tiredness, still holding the old stuffed bear. A Valorian aide knocked on the open door. Voss looked up. "Elder Salvor would like to speak with you," the aide said quietly. "He says it is urgent." "Tell him to come in," Voss said. Salvor entered a moment later. He looked older than he had that morning somehow, though Voss knew that was not possible. He looked at Maya, then at Voss. I have read what I could find of the Pale Doctrine, he said. Voss said nothing. Ambassador, Salvor said, and there was something in his old silver eyes that was close to pleading. Is there any possibility at all of standing this down? Voss looked at her daughter's bandaged arm for a moment. Then she looked at Salvor. You had 1,000 years, she said quietly. You watched every smaller species in this galaxy get pushed around and hurt and humiliated, and you called it politics. Ambassador, you watched it happen today, she said. In that room you watched and you did nothing. Salvor was quiet. Now watch this, Voss said. She did not say it with anger. She said it the way you state a fact that cannot be changed. Salvor stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back toward the archive room. He had more reading to do, and not much time left to do it in. The first hour was quiet. That was the part that no one ever forgot afterward, not the destruction itself, but the silence that came just before it. Across Creon space, life was still going on normally. Cargo ships moved between colony worlds. Workers went to their stations. Young Creon went to their learning centers. Military fleets ran their standard patrol routes in the deep lanes between stars. Then, at exactly the same moment, the 41,307 objects registered in the Galactic Assembly's public satellite registry as human survey probes, objects that had been sitting quietly in space for decades, completely ignored by everyone, treated as background noise, as harmless as floating rocks, woke up. Not with light, not with a sound, not with anything that showed up on standard Creon sensor sweeps. They simply activated. Deep inside Creon border systems, the first patrol fleet stopped transmitting. Not all at once. One by one, over the course of about 11 minutes, their signals simply ended. The Creon Military Communication Center that monitored the border lanes logged the first mistransmission as a possible technical fault. By the 5th mistransmission, they were already elevating the alert. By the 12th, they were trying to reach High Command. By the time they reached High Command, there were no more border fleets to report on. In the Galactic Assembly Hall on Concord Ring, a communication officer rushed in with a data pad and handed it to the senior Doraki delegate. The delegate read it and stood up immediately. The session that had been called to discuss the events of the morning ground to a halt. Word spread across the hall in low, urgent voices. Several delegates pulled out their own comm devices. The Valorian Elder Salvor was already standing at the side of the room, watching the large display screens that showed galactic comm traffic. The lines representing Creon outgoing signals were dropping. Not slowly, not in a pattern that suggested a technical failure. In a clean, systematic sequence that suggested something was working exactly as it was designed to work. What is happening? A young delegate from a small mining species asked the person beside her. No one answered. In the second hour, the galaxy started asking that question loudly. Alien governments across a dozen systems were calling each other in a panic. The calls were not coordinated. Everyone was talking and no one was listening, and the information coming in was moving too fast for anyone to process cleanly. What they could piece together was this. Creon border systems were going dark. Creon fleet signals were disappearing. There were no explosion readings on long-range scans. No radiation spikes. No debris clouds. Nothing that the galaxy's sensor networks recognized as combat. Things were just ending. The Doraki Council chair, still standing in his private chamber with the untouched food tray on the floor, said to his lead researcher, "What are those probes doing exactly? What is the mechanism?" The researcher looked uncomfortable. "We do not know," she said. "The humans never filed technical specifications for the survey satellites in the public registry. They only filed the locations. They filed locations but no specifications. For 40,000 satellites over 200 years, yes. And no one asked. The researcher was quiet. No one thought to ask, she said finally. They were survey satellites. Everyone knew humans were explorers. That was just what humans did. The council chair sat down heavily. No, he said, that was not what they were doing. He stared at the floor. That was what they told us they were doing, he said, and we believed them because it fit what we already thought about them. He rubbed his face. We thought they were soft, he said, because they brought their children to diplomatic sessions and they made music and they cried at things. Yes, the researcher said quietly. We were measuring the wrong things, he said. In a Creon colony ship near the outer edge of Dominion space, a junior commander named HFY was trying to get his ship moving. He had heard the alerts. He had understood what they meant faster than most of his colleagues, because he had spent 3 years at a joint diplomatic post where he had worked alongside human officers. Human officers who smiled a lot and asked questions about his family and brought extra food to share during long shifts. Human officers who also, he had noticed, never missed a single detail about the layout of the station, the position of every system, the name and rank of every person they met. He had thought at the time that they were just friendly people with good memories. He understood now that they were something more than that. He understood now that being friendly and being dangerous were not opposite things. They were, in the case of humans, exactly the same thing. His ship's engines were not responding to his commands. Not because they were damaged. Because something outside had already taken control of the systems. He sat in his command chair and he thought about what to do and found that he had no options. He opened his personal recorder. He wanted to leave something behind. Not for any military purpose. Just because he was a person and he did not want to disappear without having said anything. He pressed record. My name is HFY, he said, Junior Commander, Creon Outer Fleet, Designation 7. He paused. I think I understood humans better than most of my people, he said. I worked with them, I liked them, they were genuinely good to be around. He paused again. I think that is the thing we never understood, he said. We kept trying to figure out whether they were strong or gentle, whether they were warriors or diplomats, whether their kindness was real or performed. He leaned forward in his chair. It was all real, he said. The kindness was real, the strength was real, they are both things completely, and at the same time, and we thought those things canceled each other out, but they do not. He looked at the dark screens around him. They smiled because they had already won every war they ever needed to fight, he said. We woke something very old and very patient. He set the recorder down. Outside the ship's small window, the stars looked exactly the same as they always had. Calm and cold and very far away. In the 3rd hour, the Creon High Command sent a formal surrender request through the Assembly's emergency diplomatic channel. The automated response system, because human operators were fully occupied with other tasks, received the request, logged it, and replied within 4 seconds. The reply read, The Pale Doctrine does not have a surrender protocol, it has a completion protocol. This communication has been logged. A Creon diplomatic aide who received that response read it 3 times. Then she sat down on the floor of the communication room and stayed there. In the assembly hall on Concord Ring, the remaining delegates had stopped pretending to have a session. They were simply gathered around the display screens, watching the comm traffic lines. Watching Creon signals disappear. One by one. System by system. Fleet by fleet. A young Valorian delegate who had been in his first year of assembly service turned to Salvor and asked in a low voice, Why are they not sending more ships? Why does the human fleet not move? Where are they? Salvor watched the screens. "The human fleet has not moved," he said. "That is the point." The young delegate did not understand. "They do not need to move," Salvor said. "The work is already done. They put the pieces in place 200 years ago. They are sitting on their planet right now doing paperwork." The young delegate stared at him. "Paperwork," he said. "Logs," Salvor said. "Record system confirmations. The Pale Doctrine is not a battle. It is a scheduled task that runs to completion." The young delegate looked back at the screens. Another line went flat. "That is the most terrifying thing I have ever heard," he said. Salvor nodded. "Yes," he said, "I know." The hall was very quiet. Outside the transparent ceiling, the gas giant Vareth 9 kept turning slowly, huge and orange and completely indifferent, the way old things are indifferent to events that happen quickly in the space around them. Inside, hundreds of beings from dozens of species stood and watched a display screen and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. And because somewhere in the back of every mind in that room was a version of the same thought, shaped differently by each species' history and language and fear, but meaning the same thing. We have been living beside something we did not understand. And we are only realizing it now. 6 hours after Ambassador Ilara Voss spoke 4 words into a comm link, Earth sent a transmission. It went out on the standard Galactic Assembly broadcast frequency. It was not long. It contained no images, no music, no dramatic language. It was a single line of text. It read, "Correction complete." That was all. No explanation. No follow-up message. No list of demands or conditions. Just those 2 words and then silence. In the assembly hall on Conquered Ring, the communication officer read the message aloud. The hall had been half-emptying for the past 2 hours, as various delegations quietly gathered their things and left. Most of them heading to private comm rooms to contact their home governments. But enough delegates remained that, when the officer read the message, it echoed across a mostly empty space and landed on the ears of beings who were already exhausted and frightened, and struggling with something that did not have a simple name. It was not just shock. It was the specific feeling of realizing that you had been wrong about something very fundamental for a very long time. The Doraki delegate in the second row sat completely still for almost a minute after the message was read. Then he turned to his aide and said, "Get me every public record of human diplomatic activity from the past 200 years, every trade agreement, every summit, every formal exchange." "What are you looking for?" the aide asked. "I do not know exactly," the delegate said. "I want to see if there are things in there we missed, things we looked at and did not understand because we were looking at them the wrong way." The aide left to do that. The delegate stayed in his seat. He was a practical person. He was trying to be practical now. But underneath the practicality there was something heavy and uncomfortable that he kept stepping around and could not quite ignore. He had a daughter. She was 9 years old. She was at home right now, probably arguing with her younger brother about something unimportant. He thought about the 7-year-old human child with the stuffed bear and the yellow dress. He thought about the sound she made. He pressed his lips together and looked at the floor and was practical. In Earth's unified command center beneath the Pacific Ocean, Admiral Yara Chen received the completion confirmation from the final system verification at 6 hours and 14 minutes after activation. She looked at the number on her screen for a moment. Then she removed her glasses from her forehead, folded them carefully, and set them on the table. She stood up. The room around her was still busy. Dozens of officers running post-activation checks, logging confirmations, documenting everything in the precise and thorough way that Earth's military had always documented everything. Chen walked to the window at the far end of the room. It was not a real window. They were too far underground for that. It was a screen that showed a live feed from a camera on the surface, pointed upward at the sky. The sky was dark. It was the middle of the night on this part of Earth. The stars were visible through a gap in the clouds. Chen looked at the stars for a while. She was not celebrating. There was nothing in her that felt like celebration. She felt something that was harder to describe, a very tired, very heavy kind of rightness, like a task that needed doing had been done, and no amount of necessity made the doing of it feel clean. She stood there for 3 minutes. Then she went back to her desk and started writing the report. Back on Concord Ring, Ambassador Voss returned to the assembly hall in the early evening, ship time. She had spent most of the day in the medical bay with Maya, who had slept for several hours and then woken up and asked for food, and then drawn 11 pictures in her notebook, most of them featuring the stuffed bear in various adventures. The bear had apparently saved a planet in one picture. Maya was fine, the way children sometimes are fine, not because the bad thing had not happened, but because children process pain differently and love around them like a wall, and bounce back in ways that adults have long since forgotten how to do. Voss carried Maya on her hip as she entered the hall. The child was half asleep, face pressed against her mother's shoulder. The hall was quiet. About 40 delegates remained, seated in loose groups, talking in low voices. They went silent when Voss walked in. Voss walked to the central podium. She stood there for a moment, looking at the room. Then she spoke. "I'm not going to give a long speech," she said. "I know some of you want one. I know you want me to explain or justify or put a frame around what happened today, so it feels like something you can file away and understand." She looked around the room. "I cannot do that for you," she said. "What happened today is what it is. You all know what it is." Several delegates shifted in their seats. "What I can tell you," she said, "is what I want to happen next." She shifted Maya slightly on her hip. The child stirred, made a small sound, and went back to sleep. "I want protections," Voss said, "real ones, not resolutions with no enforcement, not agreements with optional compliance. I want binding law, assembly law, that protects every non-combatant of every species in this galaxy from harm, from intimidation, from being used as a message." She paused. "I want it written," she said, "and I want it to have teeth." A delegate near the back, one of the Valorian junior members, raised his hand. Voss looked at him. "What kind of teeth?" he asked. "The kind that make people think twice," Voss said, "the kind that mean something." He nodded slowly and sat back. Salvor stood up from his seat near the side wall. He had aged more today than in the last decade. He looked at Voss and at the sleeping child and he said, "I will personally sponsor the resolution." Voss looked at him for a long moment. She did not say thank you. She nodded once, and that was enough. Over the following weeks, something strange happened across the Galactic Assembly. In species after species, in government after government, in capital cities and council chambers and private family homes, there were reckonings. Not about humanity. About everyone else. The question that would not go away was not, what did humanity do? That part was understood. The question was, what did we do? The Valorian elder Salvor wrote in his personal journal that night, a habit he had kept for 3 centuries. "We call ourselves the oldest species. We pride ourselves on wisdom and long memory. We watch today with our long memory and our ancient wisdom, and we did nothing. A child was hurt in front of us, and we cited procedure. We cited a rule designed for debates. We let it happen because no rule technically prevented us from letting it happen." He paused in his writing. "The humans have a saying I found in their cultural records years ago and did not fully understand until today." He wrote the saying down. "The only thing necessary for evil to continue is for good people to do nothing." He closed the journal. "We have been good people doing nothing for a very long time," he wrote on the last line. "Perhaps that is finished now." In the weeks following the correction, memorial services were held on Earth. Not military parades. Not victory ceremonies. Memorial services. They were quiet and they were attended by ordinary people, families, workers, school children, who came and stood and were still in thought about what had been done and why and whether it had needed to happen and what it said about the species they were. The debates on Earth were honest and hard. Some people said it had been right. Some people said it had been too much. Some people said there should have been a warning first. Some people said a warning would have meant more children getting hurt. No one said it had been easy. No one said it had felt good. A journalist from a Doraki news outlet sent a formal request for an interview with Ambassador Voss 2 months after the events on Conquered Ring. Voss agreed. They met in a small room on the station. Maya was there, sitting at a small table in the corner, drawing in yet another notebook. The journalist looked at the child for a moment, then at Voss. "The galaxy is afraid of humanity now," the journalist said. "I know," Voss said. "Does that concern you?" Voss thought about the question. "Fear is not what I wanted," she said. "It was never what I wanted." "Then what did you want?" Voss was quiet for a moment. "I wanted a galaxy where I could bring my daughter to a summit and know she was safe," she said. "That is all I have ever wanted." The journalist wrote that down. Then he looked at Maya again. The little girl had looked up from her drawing and was looking back at him with calm, dark eyes. She had a bandage still on her arm, small and neat. She did not look afraid of him. She looked curious, the way children look at new things they are trying to understand. The journalist looked back at Voss. "Are you monsters?" he asked quietly. Voss followed his gaze to her daughter. She watched Maya go back to her drawing, the bear appearing again, this time flying through space. Voss looked back at the journalist. "No," she said. "What are you then?" Voss thought about that. About Admiral Chen at her desk, writing a report in the dark. About the young lieutenant who had pressed his lips together and gone back to work. About every human who had spent 200 years quietly, patiently, hopefully building a galaxy they wanted to live in, and also building the thing they prayed they would never have to use. "We are parents," she said. 50 years passed. The galaxy changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically, the way people imagine change happens when they think about it from a distance. It changed the way most real things change. Slowly, unevenly, in small decisions made by tired people in ordinary rooms, in children growing up in a different world than their parents had, in old laws being replaced by new ones, in habits that shifted so gradually that most people did not notice until the shift was already complete. The station called Conquered Ring was still there, orbiting Vareth 9. It had been expanded 3 times in 50 years. It was bigger now, busier, with new wings and new levels and new translation systems that handled 14 more languages than the old ones. The assembly hall itself had been redesigned. The elevated platform for dominant species had been removed. Everyone sat at the same level now. That had been one of the first changes pushed through after the Voss Accord was signed, in the months following what the official historical record called the 6-hour correction. The Voss Accord was the most comprehensive piece of assembly legislation ever passed. It took 11 months to write and was argued over fiercely by dozens of species, with competing interests and different ideas about what protection meant and who deserved it. But it passed. Every species voted yes. Not because they all agreed perfectly. Because they were all, at that particular moment in history, sitting very clearly inside the lesson that refusing to vote yes would teach them, and none of them wanted to teach it twice. The accord established universal protections for all non-combatants of all species. It created an enforcement body with real authority and real resources. It set binding consequences for violations, consequences that were enforced, not suggested. It was not a perfect document. Nothing written by committee across 100 species could be perfect. But it was real, and it had teeth, and in 50 years it had been invoked 31 times in defense of beings from 22 different species. It had never needed to be invoked in defense of a human. Not once. Not in 50 years. That fact alone told the galaxy everything it needed to know about the state of things. The historian who was compiling the official assembly record of the 6-hour correction and its aftermath was a Valorian named Rael Sova. He was young by Valorian standards, only 62, with sharp silver eyes, and a careful way of speaking that his colleagues said would serve him well in a very long career. He had spent 4 years on this project. He had interviewed hundreds of beings across dozens of species. He had read every document, every journal, every communication log that was available to him. He had sat in the archive room where Sail Vor, his great uncle, now 462 years old and still alive, though slower and quieter than he used to be, had first opened the classified files 50 years ago. He had tried very hard to write a fair and complete account. He was nearly done now. The last interview he had scheduled was with Ambassador Maya Voss. She was 57 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's way of going very still when she was listening. She wore the blue uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, with the small silver pin of Earth on the chest. She sat across from Rael Sova in a small office on Concord Ring, and she had a cup of tea, and she was patient and clear-headed, and she answered every question he asked without hedging or performing. She had a small scar on her left forearm. Rael Sova did not ask about it directly. He asked instead about her work, about the accord, about the changes she had seen in 50 years. She talked about all of it with the ease of someone who had spent decades thinking carefully about exactly these things. Near the end of the interview, Rael Sova set down his data pad. "I have one more question," he said, "and it is not an official question for the record, it is a personal question." "Ask it," she said. "You were 7 years old," he said. "When it happened you cannot fully remember it, I imagine." "I remember some of it," she said. "Does it shape how you do this work?" he asked. "Does carrying that change what kind of diplomat you are?" Maya looked at her tea for a moment. "My mother brought me to that summit because she believed that showing the galaxy a human child was a statement of good faith," she said. "She believed it said, 'We trust you with the thing we love most.'" She looked up. "I carry that," she said, "every session, every negotiation, every time I sit across from someone who represents a species with a history or a grievance or a fear. I remember that the thing my mother was trying to build was a galaxy where trust was possible, where you could walk into a room with the thing you love most and not be afraid." "And do you think we are there?" Rael Sova asked. Maya thought about that for a long moment. "We are closer," she said. 50 years ago, we were not there at all. We were pretending we were performing trust without building it. We had rules with no enforcement and agreements with no meaning." She wrapped both hands around her teacup. "Now we have something more real," she said. "Not perfect real, there is a difference." Rael Sova nodded. He picked up his data pad again. "One final thing," he said, "for the record." "Of course. How do you want human beings to be remembered in this record, in this chapter of assembly history? What is the thing you most want the reader to understand about your species?" Maya was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Rael Sova wondered if he had asked something she did not want to answer. Then she said, "We did not want to be feared." She said it simply, without drama. "We wanted to be trusted. We wanted to build something together with the rest of the galaxy. Something good and lasting. We spent 200 years being patient. We smiled, we traded, we made music. We brought our children to summits. We hoped that would be enough. She looked at her hands. It was not enough, she said, because patience without a guarantee is just hope, and hope without consequence is just a wish. She looked up. So we built the guarantee, she said, and we buried it. We hoped no one would ever make us use it. We were wrong about that. She was quiet for a moment. But we are still here, she said, still smiling, still trading, still making music, still bringing our children. She almost smiled herself. That has not changed, she said. That will not change. Rael Sova closed his data pad. He thanked her and she left, and he sat alone in the small office for a while. Later that evening, he went back to his desk and opened the document that would become the final chapter of the official record. He wrote for several hours. He covered the history of the Accord, the enforcement actions, the changes in assembly procedure, the political shifts across a dozen species, the long, slow work of building something better out of the rubble of something terrible. Then he reached the final section. He sat back in his chair. He thought about everything he had read and heard and learned in 4 years of work. He thought about the 41,000 probes sitting quietly in space for 200 years. He thought about a woman picking up a comlink and saying 4 words in a voice like a flat, dark river. He thought about a child drawing pictures of a bear who saved planets. He thought about the Accord and the 31 times it had protected beings who would otherwise have had no protection, and the fact that not one human had needed it in 50 years. He thought about what Maya Voss had said. We wanted to be trusted. He began to write the final lines of the record. He wrote, "They are not the most powerful species in the galaxy because they built better weapons than anyone else, though they did build better weapons than anyone else. They are not the most powerful species in the galaxy because they were angrier or colder or more ruthless, though when the moment came they showed the galaxy a cold and ruthless efficiency that no one who witnessed it will ever fully stop thinking about. They are the most powerful species in the galaxy because of the thing that every other species misread as weakness, and that turned out to be the deepest kind of strength there is. They genuinely, completely, inconveniently love. They love their children, and they love their home, and they love the idea of a galaxy worth living in. And they are very, very patient with that love. Patient enough to wait 200 years. Patient enough to smile and trade and make music and bring their children to summits and hope that things would work out without the guarantee ever needing to be used. And when the patience ended, when one small child cried out in a room full of beings who did not move, they showed the galaxy something else. Not that they were monsters, but that love and power were never opposites, that the deepest love carries the deepest consequence, and that you should be very careful in any galaxy about the species that smiles the most, because they have the most to protect. He saved the document. He closed his data pad. Outside the window of his office, Vareth 9 turned slowly in the dark, huge and orange and old. The stars were steady. The galaxy was quieter than it had been 50 years ago. Not silent, not finished, but quieter. And somewhere on Conquered Ring, in the big new assembly hall with no elevated platforms, a woman with a small scar on her arm was sitting at a table with a dozen beings from a dozen worlds, drinking tea and talking carefully and patiently about how to make something better. The same thing her mother had been trying to do 50 years ago. In this same station. In this same light.